disappointing.
It was a quiet afternoon in the crowded high school hallway when Naomi Clark's world shifted. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the chatter of students bouncing off the lockers like an endless wave. But none of that reached Naomi. Not when she walked into her advanced chemistry class, her heart pounding with anticipation of the upcoming science fair. The pride she felt for her work, the long nights spent refining her project on sustainable energy, had kept her hopeful despite the whispers she'd overheard in the hallways. But when Mrs. Garrett, the science teacher, stepped forward, all that hope shattered. "Naomi," Mrs. Garrett said, her voice dripping with thinly veiled sarcasm, "I'm curious how your innovative project will hold up under scrutiny." The class grew still. Naomi could feel every eye on her, some filled with pity, others with thinly veiled judgment. Before Naomi could speak, Mrs. Garrett added, "This isn't one of those feel-good projects of minorities. It's supposed to have substance, not just good intentions." The words were like a slap across Naomi's face. Her chest tightened, but she refused to let them see her break. She met her teacher's eyes, the sting of humiliation rushing through her veins. But something darker began to form, a quiet, determined fire. As she left the room that day, Mrs. Garrett's cruel laughter still ringing in her ears, Naomi vowed to show them all. She wouldn't just prove the world wrong. She would change it. Naomi Clark stepped into the classroom with quiet anticipation. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed, casting a sterile glow across the desks of her advanced chemistry class. The familiar scent of dry erase markers and textbooks filled the air, but none of this mattered. All that mattered was the project, the culmination of months of research and sleepless nights. Naomi was proud. She'd spent every spare moment refining her design for the National Sustainability Challenge. It was her chance to prove her worth in a world that often doubted her. She placed a neatly arranged presentation board and materials on the desk in front of class, barely noticing the stares from her peers. She could hear them whispering, but she forced her focus forward, away from the prying eyes. Naomi didn't have time for judgment, but she couldn't ignore the sharp, cold tone that cut through the air when Mrs. Garrett, her science teacher, spoke. "Naomi," Mrs. Garrett said, her voice oozing condescension, "let's see if your project can hold up to the scrutiny of the real world." She made a show of circling Naomi's desk, peering over the project like it was a specimen under a microscope. Naomi stood motionless, heart pounding, her breath shallow. She felt the heat rising in her chest as her classmates fell silent, their eyes glued to the scene unfolding. "This is supposed to be the National Sustainability Challenge," Mrs. Garrett continued, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Not a charity project for minorities. You might want to check your assumptions before you bring this into a professional setting." The words stung, each one slicing through Naomi's skin. She could hear the whisper starting. Snickers, sharp breaths, the faint rustling of papers as her classmates shifted in their seats. Naomi's stomach churned. She fought to keep her composure, the urge to lash out building, but she couldn't let it show. She had too much at stake. Her hand shook slightly as she adjusted the project, her mind racing. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but what would it matter? Mrs. Garrett had the power here, and Naomi knew that speaking up would only make it worse. "Is there anything else you'd like to add?" Mrs. Garrett asked, raising an eyebrow. The mocking smile on her lips felt like a slap in Naomi's face. Naomi swallowed hard, then lifted her chin, meeting Mrs. Garrett's eyes with a quiet defiance. "No, I'm good." The class remained eerily silent, and Naomi could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. As she walked back to her seat, her hands still trembling, she promised herself one thing: this wasn't the end. She would show them all. She would rise higher than they could ever imagine. Naomi sat on the edge of her bed that evening, staring at the small, flickering lamp on her nightstand. Her hands rested on her knees, and she could still feel the tremors from the humiliation of the afternoon. She replayed Mrs. Garrett's words over and over again in her mind, as though she could somehow erase them. But each repetition only made them hurt more. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, snapping her from the spiral. It was a message from Angela. "Hey, you okay? You seemed really upset after class." Want to talk? Naomi let out a long breath and picked up the phone, quickly typing out a response. I'm fine, just exhausted. A lot going on. Angela replied almost immediately. You don't have to pretend. I saw what happened today. You shouldn't let her talk to you like that. You got options, you know. Maybe we should report her? It's not okay. Naomi stared at the screen, the weight of Angela's words pressing down on her chest. Reporting Mrs. Garrett meant dragging this incident into the open, involving the school administration. Would they even care? Naomi had learned long ago that people like Mrs. Garrett rarely face consequences. People like Naomi, on the other hand, were often dismissed as being too sensitive, or worse, as troublemakers. She sighed and tapped out a reply. What's the point? They'll just dismiss it. It'll be my word against hers. I don't have a chance. The phone buzzed again. But Naomi, this is serious. People shouldn't get away with this. If we don't speak up, it's just going to keep happening. You're amazing, and your project is way more than just some minority charity thing. I'm telling you, you've got the talent. But you've also got the right to not be treated like that. Naomi stared at the words. Angela was right, but part of her feared the repercussions. What if things got worse? What if the whole school turned against her? What if they found a way to blame her for the fallout? She wasn't sure she could handle it. She typed slowly, her fingers hovering over the keys. I don't know. I just want to get through this and move on. Her phone buzzed one more time. I get it, but don't let her win. You've got a chance to make a real impact, Naomi. Don't let her stop you. Naomi set the phone down and leaned back against her pillow. The words echoed in her mind. Don't let her win. But how could she win when the system itself seemed stacked against her? She could already see the headlines in her mind. Black student cries racism after harsh criticism from teacher. It wasn't like anyone would rally to her side. There was no winning in a system that saw her as a token and nothing more. And yet, the fire inside her wouldn't be extinguished. She was tired of being overlooked, tired of people like Mrs. Garrett being able to dismiss her without consequence. She couldn't let it go. Not this time. Her gaze fell on her project materials still spread across her desk. The presentation board glinted in the low light, a symbol of everything she had poured her soul into. There was no turning back. Naomi clenched her fists, feeling the weight of the decision settle into her bones. Tomorrow, she would take a step forward. But first, she needed to finish a project, to make sure every detail was flawless. She would prove everyone wrong, especially Mrs. Garrett. But for now, she needed rest. The road ahead would not be easy. The next morning, Naomi walked through the high school hallways with a new sense of purpose. The air felt thicker than usual. She could sense the eyes of her classmates on her, some curious, some skeptical, but none willing to acknowledge what had happened the day before. Naomi kept her head high, her steps deliberate. The sense of isolation was suffocating, but she pushed through it, her determination fueling her. As she entered the chemistry classroom, she was immediately met with Mrs. Garrett's cold gaze. The teacher barely acknowledged her presence as Naomi moved to her seat, setting up her materials for the upcoming class. Mrs. Garrett's voice broke through the silence. Naomi, I hope you've taken my advice to heart. Let's see if your innovative ideas have improved since yesterday. Naomi took a deep breath and forced herself to focus on the project before her. The mocking tone still lingered, but she refused to let it affect her. She had something to prove now, not just to Mrs. Garrett, but to herself. As the bell rang and class began, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get harder, but she was ready. This was just the beginning. Naomi sat in the principal's office, the sterile, almost clinical smell of disinfectant filling the air. Her fingers drummed nervously against the arm of the chair. She had been sitting here for what felt like hours, waiting for Principal Barnes to finish his phone call. The door to his office was ajar, and she could hear snippets of the conversation, but none of it made her feel any more hopeful. Right, I'll look into it, Principal Barnes said, his voice low but clipped. Thank you for the update. He hung up and turned toward Naomi, his expression shifting to one of polite concern. Naomi, I'm sorry you had to wait so long. What can I do for you today? Naomi swallowed hard. She had been rehearsing this conversation in her head for hours. The words, the delivery, the logic behind every point she needed to make. But now that she was here, in front of the man who had the power to actually do something, she felt small again. The nerves were back, the fear creeping up her spine like a cold draft. "Mr. Barnes, I need to talk to you about something that happened in class yesterday," she began, her voice a little too shaky for her liking. "It was, well, Mrs. Garrett, my chemistry teacher. She humiliated me in front of the whole class." Principal Barnes raised an eyebrow, but he didn't seem shocked. His gaze remained neutral, unreadable. "Go on." Naomi took a steadying breath, then launched into the story. She told him everything. Mrs. Garrett's mocking tone, her dismissive comments about Naomi's project, how the teacher had insinuated that Naomi wasn't capable of competing at the national level because of her race. She told him about the way Mrs. Garrett had mocked the very idea of her being involved in the competition, and how she belittled Naomi in front of her peers. When she finished, there was a long silence. Principal Barnes didn't say anything right away. He folded his hands on his desk and studied her, his eyes calculating. "I see," he said finally, his voice neutral, almost too calm. "Naomi, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. I will, of course, look into the matter." He paused, as if weighing his next words. "But you have to understand that Mrs. Garrett is a well-respected member of our faculty. She's been teaching here for over 20 years. This is likely just a misunderstanding, a miscommunication. Perhaps we'll get to the bottom of it." Naomi blinked. A misunderstanding? Her stomach sank. She had expected something, anything, that might give her a glimmer of hope, but instead, she was left feeling like she was the one at fault for even bringing it up. "Sir," Naomi said, trying to keep the edge of frustration out of her voice, "I don't think it's a misunderstanding." It felt deliberate. She made it clear that she doesn't believe someone like me should be involved in something as important as the National Sustainability Challenge. "I don't feel safe in her class anymore." Principal Barnes' expression hardened slightly, and Naomi could sense the shift. But it wasn't the shift of someone ready to act. It was the shift of someone who had already made up his mind. "I'll have a conversation with Mrs. Garrett," he said, his tone clipped. "But Naomi, you need to understand that sometimes things like this are more complicated than they seem. I can't promise you that everything will change overnight. In the meantime, I expect you to continue focusing on your studies and your project. I wouldn't want this to distract you from the competition." The words hung in the air, hollow and dismissive. Naomi's heart clenched. He wasn't hearing her. No one ever did. "I understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Mr. Barnes." She stood up to leave, but just before she stepped out the door, Principal Barnes added, "And Naomi, remember, we don't want to make waves. Let's just handle this quietly, all right?" Naomi nodded, though the last shred of respect she had for the school crumbled in that moment. She was a problem to be solved, a nuisance to be swept under the rug. As she left the office, the weight of the conversation settled over her like a dark cloud. Nothing had changed. Nothing ever would. The hallway felt colder as Naomi made her way back to class. She could feel the eyes on her again, whispers trailing behind her like a shadow. The usual hum of student chatter seemed distant, muffled, as if she were in a dream. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to tell everyone that this wasn't just a minor issue. But Naomi knew the truth. No one would listen. She had expected this. Expected the system to fail her, to protect Mrs. Garrett, to bury the problem with a few polite words and promises that meant nothing. But still, the defeat felt bitter in her mouth. When she entered the classroom, she could feel Mrs. Garrett's eyes on her immediately. The teacher didn't even look up as Naomi took her seat, but there was a tension in the air, like a quiet storm waiting to break. Naomi felt the storm too, but this time it didn't frighten her. Instead of the usual sarcastic comments or jabs, Mrs. Garrett said nothing. It was as if Naomi had become invisible. And for the first time, Naomi appreciated the silence. But the silence wouldn't last forever. It never did. The next few days passed in a blur of assignments and tension. Naomi did her best to keep her head down, her focus on her project, but the feeling of isolation weighed heavily on her. In the hallways, she was a ghost, there but unseen. Her classmates, the ones who had watched the humiliation in class, avoided her gaze. Some seemed uncomfortable, unsure how to act after witnessing Mrs. Garrett's sharp words. Naomi could feel their eyes when they passed, but it wasn't the pitying kind of gaze. No, it was the kind that made her feel like she was an outsider, someone who didn't belong, someone who had overstayed their welcome. She spent late nights refining her project, tweaking every detail. The lab results, the calculations, the models, it was all perfect. But even as she worked tirelessly, doubts crept in. What if it wasn't enough? What if Mrs. Garrett was right? Naomi didn't just fear failure. She feared being dismissed. It wasn't just about winning the National Sustainability Challenge anymore. It was about proving something deeper, about showing everyone that she was more than what they thought she was. One afternoon, after yet another sleepless night, Naomi found herself sitting in the school courtyard with Angela, the only person who had been there for her. Angela's voice broke through Naomi's spiraling thoughts. "You're not thinking about giving up, are you?" Naomi didn't answer right away. She stared at her hands, fingers curling around the edges of her notebook, her eyes fixed on the ground. The sunlight filtered through the trees, but it didn't feel warm. Nothing felt warm anymore. "I don't know, Naomi murmured, her voice barely audible. "What if it's not enough? What if my project really is just some feel-good thing for minorities like she said? What if I don't have a chance?" Angela reached across the table, placing a hand gently on Naomi's. "You do have a chance, Naomi. You've worked too hard for this. It's not about what Mrs. Garrett said. It's about what you know you can do. You've got talent. You've got a vision. You're not just doing this for yourself. You're doing it for all the kids who've been told they can't. Don't let them take that from you." Naomi looked up at Angela, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes, but the weight of her doubts still lingered in the pit of her stomach. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I'm scared of what happens if I fail. And I'm scared of what happens if I succeed. What if I win and they still try to find a way to tear me down?" Angela squeezed her hand tighter. "Then you keep pushing. You don't let them tear you down. Whatever happens, you've already won, Naomi. You've already shown them your worth. Don't let anyone take that from you." Naomi took a deep breath, the words settling into her like a quiet promise. Angela was right, as always. She had spent so much time focusing on the things she couldn't control, how others saw her, what they thought of her, when the only thing that truly mattered was the work she had done. The project wasn't just a reflection of her ability. It was a declaration of who she was. Naomi wasn't going to let anyone take that away. "I'm going to finish this," Naomi said firmly, her resolve hardening. "I'm going to finish it for me. And if they can't see that, that's their problem." Angela smiled, her eyes full of pride. "That's my girl." Naomi nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. But as she stood up to leave, a nagging thought lingered at the back of her mind. Even with Angela's support, even with her own determination, the road ahead was still treacherous. Mrs. Garrett's cruelty hadn't gone unnoticed, and Naomi wasn't naive enough to think it would just fade away. The question wasn't whether she could win. The question was, would they let her? The next morning, Naomi walked into Mrs. Garrett's class with a steady breath, the familiar weight of her project materials in her hands. Mrs. Garrett didn't make a scene that day. In fact, the teacher barely acknowledged Naomi at all, her cold demeanor a stark contrast to the fiery mockery Naomi had endured the week before. Naomi didn't care. She wasn't there for Mrs. Garrett's approval. She was there for herself. After class, Naomi stopped by Mr. Reynolds' office, the chemistry tutor who had become her quiet ally. Mr. Reynolds had been kind to her, offering encouragement when no one else did, and he had helped her refine her project in ways she hadn't even imagined. "You look different today," Mr. Reynolds commented as Naomi walked in. Naomi smiled faintly, though the weight of the world still lingered in her eyes. "I'm different today. I think I finally figured out what matters." Mr. Reynolds studied her for a moment, his expression softening. "You're going to do great, Naomi. Just keep believing in yourself. The rest will follow." She nodded, the warmth of his words filling her with a quiet sense of confidence. For the first time in days, She felt like she could face whatever came next. Whether or not Mrs. Garrett approved, whether or not the school believed in her, Naomi was going to make her mark. She would show them all that her worth wasn't determined by their prejudices. Her project was a proof, and she would make sure the world saw it. Naomi's hand shook slightly as she arranged the last of her materials on the workbench in the school lab. The hum of fluorescent lights and the faint smell of chemicals in the air were familiar, but today everything felt more surreal. She had spent the past few days refining every detail of her project, double-checking her calculations, and ensuring the presentation was perfect. There was nothing more she could do, but the feeling of impending judgment was always there, lingering in the back of her mind. Mrs. Garrett's silence in class had been suffocating. She hadn't even acknowledged Naomi's project since the public humiliation. It was like Naomi had become invisible to her, and that was somehow worse than the cruel words from before. Mrs. Garrett wasn't actively trying to undermine her now. She was simply indifferent. It was as though Naomi didn't even exist. Naomi's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She turned to find Mr. Reynolds, her chemistry tutor, standing in the doorway, his warm smile a welcome change from the cold indifference she had been dealing with all week. "You look like you're about to burn the lab down with all that focus," he joked, stepping into the room. "Mind if I take a look?" Naomi offered a tight smile, grateful for the rare moment of kindness. "I think I've got everything under control. I'm just trying to make sure it's perfect." Mr. Reynolds raised an eyebrow, sensing the undercurrent of anxiety in her voice. "You've got something to prove, don't you?" Naomi nodded, her throat tight. "Yeah, every day. It feels like I'm proving something, that I belong here, that my work is worth something." Mr. Reynolds stepped closer to her project, his gaze studying the intricate details with a quiet appreciation. "Naomi, this is exceptional. What you've done here, this is the kind of innovation the world needs. You've put in the work, the thought, the effort. It's all here. This is real science." Her chest tightened at his words. "Thanks, Mr. Reynolds. But sometimes I feel like it's not enough. Like no matter how hard I try, it's never going to be seen as valuable. People like me, we're not supposed to make a difference in places like this." He turned toward her, his expression serious. "Naomi, that's where you're wrong. You don't need anyone's permission to make a difference. You're already doing it with this project. You're already challenging the norms. And I'll tell you something else. You don't need their validation. It's nice when we get it. Sure. But you don't need them to tell you your worth. You know your worth." Naomi looked down at the project on the table, her fingers gently tracing the edges of the presentation board. She wasn't sure if she could truly believe those words, but something about them felt like a small spark of light in the darkness. "What if they don't believe in me, though?" Naomi whispered, almost afraid to voice the doubt out loud. "What if I win and they still find a way to dismiss me? What if Mrs. Garrett just ignores my victory, like she's ignored everything else?" Mr. Reynolds leaned against the workbench, his voice steady but firm. "Then you make them see you. You make them recognize your talent. You don't let them silence you. This project, this challenge, you've earned every bit of it, Naomi. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Naomi let his words sink in, the weight of them settling into her chest. The support he was offering wasn't just about her project. It was about her as a person, her potential, her future. It was the kind of encouragement she hadn't received from the very system she had been trying to navigate. Naomi felt a mix of gratitude and guilt. She had expected support from the people who were supposed to care about her progress, her teachers, her school. But now, here it was from the one person who had no real obligation to help her, no personal stake in her success. Mr. Reynolds didn't have to believe in her, but he did. "Thanks," Naomi said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. I really needed to hear that." "You don't need to thank me," Mr. Reynolds said with a smile. "Just keep doing what you're doing. You've got the skills. You've got the vision. Now go show them." The weight on Naomi's shoulders felt just a little bit lighter after that conversation. She still wasn't sure what would come next, but for the first time in a long while, she wasn't so afraid of it. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for things to change, and it was up to her to make that change happen. The bell rang. signaling the end of class. Naomi gathered her materials, packing them up with newfound resolve. She was ready for whatever came next. She wasn't going to let Mrs. Garrett's silence or the school's indifference define her. She would take her project to the National Sustainability Challenge, and she would show the world what she was capable of. And when she returned, she would make sure they knew who Naomi Clark was. The air in Washington, D.C. felt thick with possibility. Naomi stood in the convention center lobby, her heart pounding in her chest as she surveyed the bustling crowd of students, all eager to showcase their groundbreaking projects at the National Sustainability Challenge. The bright lights and polished floors felt foreign, intimidating even, but she held her head high. She belonged here, no matter what anyone had said. Her project, neatly arranged on a large display table, was a culmination of months of work. A sustainable energy solution designed to use solar panels in conjunction with wind turbines to create a more cost-effective way to harness renewable energy. The judges would scrutinize every detail, every calculation, every aspect of the project. But Naomi didn't feel scared anymore. She felt determined. It had been a long, exhausting road to get here. After her conversation with Mr. Reynolds, Naomi had realized that she wasn't just competing for the medal or the recognition. She was competing for her own place in the world, a place that she had to carve out for herself. For weeks, she had poured every ounce of energy into making sure her project was flawless. And now, it was time to see if it would stand up to best. As she set up her display, Naomi couldn't help but notice the way some of the other students looked at her. It wasn't the open ridicule of Mrs. Garrett's classroom, but it was something else, a quiet, dismissive air that seemed to say, "What is she doing here?" They were all so much older, some of them college students, some of them seasoned professionals with years of experience. Naomi felt like a small fish in a giant pond, but she kept telling herself, "You belong here." She repeated it in her head like a mantra. "You look like you could use some help." A voice interrupted her thoughts. Naomi turned to find another student standing beside her, a tall, dark-skinned boy with a friendly smile. His name tag read Jaden Williams. "I'm Jaden," he said, offering his hand. "I saw you setting up. You're presenting your project on sustainable energy, right?" Naomi hesitated for a moment, surprised by the kindness. Most students here were too focused on their own projects to even make eye contact. "Yes, I am," Naomi said, shaking his hand. "Naomi Clark." "Nice to meet you, Naomi. That's an incredible project you've got there. I've been studying renewable energy for a few years, and your approach to combining solar and wind is really innovative. Are you focusing on making the technology more affordable for developing countries?" Naomi blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected anyone to understand the depth of her project, let alone appreciate it so quickly. She hadn't even mentioned that aspect of her work to many people. "Yeah, that's exactly it," Naomi said, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. "I've been working on ways to make it more affordable, so it can be accessible to countries that need it the most. The ultimate goal is to make sustainable energy available for everyone, no matter where they live." "That's powerful," Jaden said, nodding. "It's not just about technology. It's about making a difference. And that's something I think the judges will notice. But you're not just up against the clock. You're up against a system that's not built for people like us." Naomi was silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. It wasn't just a competition that was hard. It was everything that had led her here. The quiet biases she'd face in school, the prejudice from her teacher, the sense that no matter how hard she worked, she would always be underestimated. Jaden was right. This wasn't just a competition. It was a test of whether she could even belong in this space at all. "I guess we'll see how it all turns out," Naomi said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "But I'm not backing down. I've worked too hard for that." Jaden grinned. "I like your attitude. We should grab lunch after the presentation. I'm sure we'll both need to talk through everything afterward." Naomi agreed, the lightness of their conversation grounding her, giving her the strength to stand tall in a room full of unfamiliar faces. She felt like a stranger here, but for the first time, she was beginning to feel that maybe, just maybe, it was okay to be a stranger in a place that wasn't quite built for her. Maybe that was where change started. The next few hours passed in a blur. Naomi's project was thoroughly examined by a panel of judges, each of them asking sharp, precise questions about the science behind her work. Naomi answered each one with confidence, but even as she spoke, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was a part of her that was still waiting for the other shoe to drop. The questioning was intense, but it wasn't cruel. The judges seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say, and for the first time, Naomi allowed herself to believe that maybe she had something worth hearing. After her presentation, she wandered around the convention center, taking in the other projects. There were some truly impressive works on display. Engineering marvels, groundbreaking research on medical technology, and environmental solutions that pushed the boundaries of what Naomi had even thought possible. She felt a pang of inadequacy, but she pushed it down, focusing instead on the purpose that had gotten her here. She was here to prove that her voice, her work, mattered. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was being heard. By the time lunch rolled around, Naomi and Jaden found a quiet corner in the cafeteria. As they ate, they traded stories about their projects and their experiences. Jaden had faced similar doubts about his own research on alternative fuels, but like Naomi, he had learned to ignore the naysayers and focus on his work. "I think you got a real shot at this," Jaden said as he finished his sandwich. "I can't think of anyone else who deserves to win more than you." Naomi smiled, the weight of his words lifting a little more of the burden from her shoulders. "Thanks, Jaden. I needed to hear that." "You've earned it," he said. "You're not just here to win a medal. You're here to make an impact, and that's what counts." Naomi looked around the room, feeling a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in months. This was it. This was her moment. No matter what happened, Naomi Clark had already won. The grand auditorium was filled with a hum of anxious anticipation as Naomi sat in the audience, waiting for the award ceremony to begin. The golden lights of the stage reflected off the polished floors, casting long shadows across the room. Students from across the country, some dressed in business attire, others in more casual clothing, milled about, their eyes darting nervously between their projects and the podium at the front. The chatter of excited voices mixed with the occasional cough, and Naomi felt a weight settle deep in her chest. Her palms were clammy, her heart racing. The project she had poured her soul into, the months of relentless work and sacrifice. What if it wasn't enough? What if the judges didn't see the value in her work, in her passion? Naomi clenched her fists in her lap, trying to steady her nerves, but the doubt still lingered, swirling in the back of her mind. She glanced to her right at Jaden, who was sitting next to her. He gave her a reassuring smile, but Naomi could see the tension in his eyes. They were both on the edge of something monumental, but neither knew how it would unfold. "This is it," Jaden whispered, his voice tight with nervous excitement. "No matter what happens, we've made it this far." Naomi nodded but didn't respond. The sound of the host's voice echoed through the room, announcing that the ceremony was about to begin. Naomi sat up straighter, her throat dry, her thoughts momentarily wiped clean by the gravity of the moment. This wasn't just about the competition. It was about recognition, about being seen for who she truly was, not just a minority student or a token entry. It was about showing the world the worth of her voice, her ideas, her intellect. As the award ceremony kicked off, Naomi's focus wavered. The host called out names, and with each announcement, the crowd cheered and clapped. But with every applause that filled the room, Naomi felt her heart sink a little more. The winners seemed to be the usual crowd, the wealthy private school students, the ones with years of resources behind them, with the polished presentations and extensive support systems. Naomi's project, her project that could change the world, felt like an afterthought in the midst of all the brilliance surrounding her. Then, the host's voice rang out, clear and bright, cutting through the din. "And the first place winner for the National Sustainability Challenge is Naomi Clark." For a second, the world went quiet. Naomi blinked, her brain struggling to process the words. The room seemed to warp around her. Had she heard that right? Her name? The applause that followed was deafening, and Naomi's heart leapt in her chest as she stood up, her legs trembling with a mix of shock and disbelief. A smile tugged at her lips, but it felt like it didn't quite belong to her. She was in a daze, walking toward the stage as the sound of congratulatory shouts and cheers rang in her ears. As she approached the podium, the host handed her the trophy, a gleaming gold medal that shimmered under the stage lights. Naomi could barely hold it steady, her fingers numb. The microphone was handed to her, and she looked out over the crowd, a sea of faces watching her, some unfamiliar, some vaguely familiar from the past few days of the competition. Her throat tightened. The weight of the moment was almost too much to bear. For a moment, Naomi could hear Mrs. Garrett's mocking tone in her head. "It's just a charity project for minorities. You won't go far. Not with that attitude. Not with that background." But now, standing on the stage, Naomi felt something different, something stronger. The words of Mr. Reynolds echoed in her mind. "You don't need anyone's permission to make a difference. You're already doing it." She raised the microphone to her lips, her voice steady despite the swirling emotions inside her. "I just want to say," Naomi began, "that this isn't just a win for me. This is for everyone who has been told they're not enough. For everyone who's been made to feel like their voice doesn't matter. For everyone who's been pushed to the sidelines and told they'll never succeed. This is for you." The crowd fell silent, and Naomi could hear her heart beating in her ears. This wasn't just about the medal in her hands. It was about something far bigger. She had fought her whole life to be seen, and now she was being seen. But there was still a piece of her that couldn't quite accept the victory. It wasn't just the joyous success that filled her. It was the bittersweet realization that her journey had been so much harder than it needed to be, that so many others with far less talent would have had an easier time getting here. But Naomi wasn't going to let that ruin the moment. "I'm proud of who I am," Naomi continued, her voice stronger now, more confident. "I'm proud of my heritage, my story, and my work. No one can take that from me." The applause that followed felt like the world shifting. It felt like the start of something new, not just for Naomi, but for everyone who'd been made to feel small. As Naomi left the stage, her head held high, she could see the faces of the other competitors, some of them offering nods of respect, others clearly disappointed. But it didn't matter. She had won. She had proven herself, not to them, but to herself. The rest of the ceremony continued, but Naomi barely noticed. Her mind kept returning to the moment she had just experienced. She had risen above the doubts, the insults, the systemic barriers. She had fought for herself, and she had won. She couldn't help but think of Mrs. Garrett, how she had tried to break her, how she had tried to make Naomi believe she wasn't good enough. But now, Naomi had the medal, the recognition, and the knowledge that she had done something that couldn't be ignored. It wasn't over yet, but this victory was just the beginning. Naomi's return to school was met with mixed emotions. The moment she walked to the front doors of the high school, clutching her shiny national medal in her hand, everything felt different. The usual hum of hallway chatter and the routine bustle of lockers opening and closing seemed distant, as if she were in a world all her own. Her classmates paused, their conversations faltering as they caught sight of the gleaming medal swinging from her fingers. Some students offered tentative smiles, nodding in acknowledgement of her achievement. Others, the more familiar faces, the ones who watched her endure ridicule and mockery in Mrs. Garrett's class, looked away, as though avoiding eye contact would make the reality of her victory less real. Naomi noticed the awkward silence that fell over the room as she passed. Some faces were filled with pride for her. Others were filled with envy, resentment, or discomfort. But Naomi kept her head high as she walked to her locker, the medal still hanging proudly from her neck. She had won. That much was undeniable. No one could take that from her. When she entered Mrs. Garrett's classroom, however, the silence was deafening. The class had already started, and Naomi took her seat, placing her bag on the desk. Mrs. Garrett, standing at the front of the room, didn't look up. There was a tightness in her posture, the way her shoulders were drawn back, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Naomi," Mrs. Garrett said, her voice cold and clipped, "I see you've returned." Naomi didn't respond at first. She simply pulled out her notebook, tried to avoid making eye contact with the teacher. Mrs. Garrett, of course, was the last person Naomi wanted to speak to right now. After all the cruel words she had spoken, after the way she had belittled Naomi's talent and potential, the teacher's opinion no longer mattered. But the weight of Mrs. Garrett's gaze was impossible to ignore. "You've won, I see," Mrs. Garrett continued, her tone colder than usual. I'm sure the competition must have been interesting. Naomi's chest tightened at the insincerity in Mrs. Garrett's voice. It was clear to her that her victory hadn't gone unnoticed, and Mrs. Garrett wasn't about to give her the validation she so clearly deserved. That's right, Naomi said, her voice steady, her gaze finally meeting Mrs. Garrett's. I won the National Sustainability Challenge. My project was selected for its innovation and impact. Mrs. Garrett's lips twitched, as if she were suppressing a sneer. I'm sure it was. But you know, Naomi, sometimes these things are about who you know, not what you know. Naomi's hands clenched into fists on top of her desk, but she forced herself to stay calm. She wasn't going to let Mrs. Garrett get under her skin. Not today. I don't know about that, Mrs. Garrett, Naomi said, her voice cool, but I do know that my work stood up on its own merit, and that's something I'm proud of. A silence fell between them. Naomi felt the weight of the class's attention as she sat there, meeting Mrs. Garrett's gaze unwaveringly. The tension in the room was palpable, like the air was thick with unspoken words. Mrs. Garrett seemed to falter for just a moment, and then her expression hardened, her eyes narrowing slightly. Well, Mrs. Garrett said after a long pause, congratulations, and I suppose we all have much to learn from your success. Naomi didn't respond. She didn't need to. The words Mrs. Garrett had left unspoken were clear enough. She could see in the teacher's eyes the simmering resentment, the barely concealed anger. But Naomi wasn't afraid anymore. She had proved herself, and nothing Mrs. Garrett said or did could take that away. Later that afternoon, Naomi was called to the principal's office. Her heart sank as she entered, the familiar sterile scent of his office suddenly suffocating. Principal Barnes sat behind his desk, his expression serious, his fingers steepled in front of him. Naomi, he began, his voice even, I want to congratulate you on your success at the National Sustainability Challenge. It's no small achievement. Naomi nodded, grateful for the acknowledgement, but still feeling uneasy. She had a nagging suspicion that this conversation wasn't going to be as pleasant as the congratulations. Thank you, she said, keeping her tone polite but guarded. There was a pause, and Principal Barnes's gaze softened ever so slightly. However, he continued, there have been some concerns raised about your recent success. Specifically, some faculty members have questioned whether your victory reflects the kind of work we want to encourage at this school. Some feel that your project might be more of a feel-good initiative than a serious scientific contribution. And of course, there are concerns about the potential backlash from the community. Naomi's stomach twisted as she listened, her mind racing. Backlash? Community? What was he saying? That her victory wasn't legitimate? That her work didn't matter? Principal Barnes, Naomi said, her voice sharp, my project was groundbreaking. I proved that renewable energy can be harnessed more effectively for everyone, no matter their background. I didn't do this to make people feel good. I did it because it's the right thing to do. Barnes nodded, but there was a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. I understand that, Naomi, but I think you need to realize that your victory, while impressive, has stirred up more than just pride. It's also stirred up a lot of discomfort. Not everyone is ready for this kind of change. Not everyone is ready for what you represent. Naomi felt a chill crawl up her spine. What I represent? She echoed, confused. What do you mean by that? Naomi, this isn't easy to say, but sometimes the reality is that change comes at cost. And not everyone in the school is prepared to accept the kind of change you've brought. You're challenging norms, and that can be difficult for some. It hit Naomi like a slap across the face. Challenging norms. What he was really saying was that her success, her brilliance, made people uncomfortable. And it wasn't just about her project. It was about everything she represented. So what are you saying? Naomi's voice cracked despite her best efforts to stay composed. You want me to apologize for winning? For proving that I belong here? Principal Barnes's expression shifted again, this time into one of unease. No, Naomi, I'm not asking you to apologize. I'm simply telling you that there are forces in place, systems in place, that might not support what you're doing. I'm advising you to be careful, to think about the bigger picture. Naomi stood up, the weight of the conversation pressing down on her. She had hoped for support, for recognition, for validation, but instead, she was being told that her victory had come at the cost of her place in the system she had fought so hard to navigate. "I don't need to think about the bigger picture, Mr. Barnes," Naomi said, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm already living it, and I'm not backing down. Not now, not ever." As she walked out of the office, her chest tight with a mixture of frustration and resolve, Naomi realized something. Winning the medal was just a beginning. There was still a long road ahead, one that she would walk, no matter how hard it got. The world wasn't going to change easily, but she was ready to change it. She was just getting started. Naomi spent the following weeks in a state of quiet defiance, holding on to the momentum of her victory, while pushing through the subtler forms of resistance that had sprung up in her wake. Despite the cheers she had received at the National Sustainability Challenge, the reality of her life back at school was much less celebratory. Mrs. Garrett's veiled disdain continued in the classroom, and Principal Barnes had all but disappeared into the background, leaving Naomi with the sense that her win had only deepened the divide between her and the system that had been built to exclude her. The whispers in the halls never stopped. Her classmates, some who had once ignored her entirely, now seemed to look at her with a mix of begrudging respect and quiet animosity. Naomi wasn't sure if they saw her as a threat or an anomaly, but the feeling of isolation had returned, perhaps stronger than before. She no longer wanted to prove herself to them. That was something she had already done. Now, she just had to figure out how to survive in a place that wasn't built for her to thrive. But Naomi wasn't the kind to back down. Not anymore. One afternoon, after a long day of class, Naomi sat at her desk in the library, going over her project one more time. She had promised herself that she wouldn't just stop here, that she would use her victory to drive further change. Her work on renewable energy had already made waves in the competition, but there was still so much to be done. The problem was bigger than just proving herself. It was about changing how the world viewed sustainability, how it treated innovation that came from people like her. That night, Naomi decided she was going to write an op-ed for the school paper. She had been writing pieces about sustainability before, but this time it was going to be different. This time it would be personal. She would speak out about everything: the systemic racism, the dismissive attitudes, the way people like Mrs. Garrett tried to bury her potential. She would expose the system for what it was and force them to see her, to hear her, and to acknowledge her work. The next day, Naomi walked into the school's newspaper office, a bundle of papers clutched in her hands. She approached the editor-in-chief, Rachel, a classmate she'd barely spoken to until now. "Rachel," Naomi said, her voice unwavering despite the nerves that threatened to overtake her. "I want to write an op-ed about the challenges I've faced during this project. I want to write about what it means to be a black student fighting against a system that's stacked against you, even when you work twice as hard to prove yourself." Rachel's eyes widened, her brow furrowing as she took in Naomi's words. "I'm not going to lie, Naomi, that's pretty bold, but I think it's important. If you want to write it, I'll help you get it published. People need to hear your story." Naomi let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For a brief moment, she had expected Rachel to question her, to back away, but instead, there was an understanding in the girl's gaze. It was a recognition that Naomi wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for anyone who had been silenced. "Thank you," Naomi said, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't know how much that means to me." The days following her submission were filled with tense anticipation. Naomi kept going to class, keeping her head down, her eyes focused on her work. Mrs. Garrett's attitude remained unchanged, though she seemed to avoid interacting with Naomi whenever possible. Naomi knew the teacher was watching, silently hoping her efforts would be forgotten, but Naomi wasn't about to let that happen. Then, one morning, Naomi walked into the cafeteria to find several copies of school newspapers spread across the tables, the front page staring back at her in bold letters. "The Silent Struggle: A Black Student's Fight Against Systemic Racism in Academia." Naomi's heart skipped a beat as she walked over to one of the tables, her eyes scanning the words she had written. The article detailed her journey, from the public humiliation at the hands of Mrs. Garrett to her determination to overcome the odds and win the national medal. She had pulled no punches, detailing the ways in which the system had failed her, how her teachers had dismissed her talent, and how the administration had ignored her cries for support. Naomi had spoken openly about the subtle racism embedded within the very fabric of school, from coded language to the barriers that prevented students like her from truly succeeding. As Naomi skimmed the article, she noticed the reactions of students around her. A few were reading it silently, their brows furrowed in thought. Others were whispering, exchanging knowing glances. It was clear that the piece had hit home for many of them. But Naomi's eyes found someone else in the cafeteria, Mrs. Garrett. The teacher was standing near the food line, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, her face flushed with anger. When she saw Naomi looking at her, she turned away, her gaze hard and dismissive. Naomi's stomach churned, but she didn't let it show. She had expected this. Mrs. Garrett wasn't going to take kindly to being called out, especially not in front of the entire school. After the lunch bell rang, Naomi made her way to her next class, her heart pounding in her chest. As she walked into the room, she was greeted by a rare silence. Her classmates had already seen the article, and there was a heaviness in the air, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. Then, Mrs. Garrett's voice cut through the stillness. "Naomi Clark," she said, her tone frigid, "I see you made your opinion very clear. I would appreciate it if you kept your grievances out of my classroom from now on." Naomi stood tall, meeting her teacher's gaze. The fire that had been lit in her since the moment Mrs. Garrett had belittled her was burning bright now. She wasn't going to back down. "I'm not keeping anything to myself anymore, Mrs. Garrett," Naomi said, her voice steady. "And I'm not going to be quiet about the way I've been treated. If you want to know what it's like to face systemic racism, you should start by listening." The class was silent. Mrs. Garrett's face reddened, but Naomi didn't flinch. She had said her piece. The words that had been building inside her for so long had finally been released. As the bell rang and students filed out of the classroom, Naomi felt something shift. It wasn't just the weight of Mrs. Garrett's anger. It was a feeling of power, of speaking truth to those who had been so quick to silence her. This was just the beginning. And Naomi knew one thing for sure. She wasn't done yet. The weeks following Naomi's op-ed were a whirlwind. The school, which had once felt like an alienating maze, now seemed to hum with new energy, quiet but undeniable. Naomi's article had stirred something in the student body. Conversations about race, about equality, about the subtle ways systemic bias affected their education were happening everywhere now. Some students were uncomfortable, others were angry, but many were listening. And that, Naomi knew, was the first step. Even Mrs. Garrett's coldness seemed to have softened, if only slightly. It wasn't that Naomi expected her to apologize or change overnight, but there was something different in the way the teacher interacted with her. Less dismissive, perhaps more cautious. Naomi didn't know what to make of it, but she wasn't about to waste time figuring it out. The battle was never about one person. It was about changing the system, dismantling the barriers, and letting the truth breathe. At home, things were quieter. Her parents had always supported her, but they didn't fully understand the weight she carried in her school life. Still, when they saw her walk into the living room one evening with the newspaper clutched in her hands, they didn't need an explanation. They already knew what it meant. "You did it, Naomi," her father said, his voice a mixture of pride and disbelief. "You really did it." Naomi smiled softly, her mother standing beside him, arms crossed, eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't do it alone," she replied, her voice steady but filled with an unspoken gratitude. "It's because of everyone who helped me, who believed in me." Her mother nodded. "We believed in you from the start, but you had to do the hard work." "I'll keep doing the work," Naomi said, her heart swelling with determination. "This isn't over. It's just the beginning." As Naomi sat in her room that evening, reflecting on everything that had happened, on the humiliation, the triumph, the unexpected support from people like Mr. Reynolds and Jaden, she knew that she had stepped into something bigger than herself. The medal, the recognition, it was important, yes, but the real victory was what she had learned about herself, about the resilience that lived inside her, the strength that had always been there, waiting for the moment when she would finally claim it. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, Naomi knew that, but as she stared out her window, watching the sunset cast warm hues across the sky, she understood one simple truth. The future was hers to write. It wasn't about just winning. It was about making sure others had the same chance to succeed, to be seen, to be heard. Naomi had the power to change the world, and she would do it, one step at a time. Her journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning. And Naomi Clark would never stop fighting.